93. The Zeros came in fast, 3 of them cutting through the morning sky over Bougainville like razors through silk. Lieutenant Rex Barber kept his P-38 Lightning steady, watched them close the distance, watched their pilots get confident. Then one of his engines exploded. Black smoke poured from the right nacelle, thick and angry, trailing behind him like a funeral shroud. The Japanese pilots saw it. They knew what it meant. A crippled American fighter, limping home, easy prey. They moved in for the kill. What they didn't know was that Rex Barber had just become the most dangerous pilot in the Solomon Islands. It was April 1943, and the war in the Pacific had turned into a meat grinder of attrition. Every island, every coral reef, every mile of ocean was paid for in blood. The P-38 Lightning was supposed to be America's answer to Japanese air superiority, a twin-engine fighter with the range to escort bombers deep into enemy territory and the firepower to shred anything that got in its way. But the Lightning had a reputation. Pilots called it the fork-tailed devil. The Japanese called it 2 planes, 1 pilot, and when one of those engines quit, conventional wisdom said you were done. You nursed at home if you could, you ditched if you couldn't, but you didn't fight. Rex Barber hadn't gotten the memo. The right engine was finished, completely dead, the propeller windmilling uselessly in the slipstream. The P-38 wanted to roll, wanted to spin, wanted to auger straight into the jungle canopy 10,000 feet below. Every instinct screamed at him to break off, to dive for the deck, to get out while he still could. But there were 3 Zeros behind him now, and they were getting closer. He could see the lead pilot through his canopy, could see the rising sun on the fuselage, could almost see the smile on the man's face. They thought this was over. They thought wrong. Barber chopped the throttle on the dead engine completely, feathered the prop to reduce drag, then firewalled the left engine. The asymmetric thrust tried to tear the aircraft apart. The rudder pedal was jammed so hard to the left, his legs started to cramp, but the Lightning responded. It always responded. The aircraft had been designed with this exact scenario in mind, engineered to fly and fight on one engine if it had to. The Japanese pilots didn't know that. They'd never seen it done. They thought physics was on their side. The first Zero overshot. The pilot had been so focused on the smoking engine, so certain of an easy kill, that he misjudged the closure rate. He flashed past Barber's canopy close enough to see the leather of his flight helmet, close enough to count rivets, and for just a fraction of a second, he was directly in front of the P-38's guns. Barber didn't hesitate. 450 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon opened up simultaneously. The range was point blank. The Zero disintegrated. Pieces of wing, chunks of fuselage, a spinning propeller blade tumbling end over end toward the ocean. The pilot never had time to react. He was there, and then he wasn't. The other 2 scattered. Panic did what training couldn't. They'd just watched their element leader get vaporized by a plane that was supposed to be dying. The tactical situation had inverted in a heartbeat. Now they were the ones in danger. Now they were the ones trying to survive. Barber pressed the attack. The P-38 was sluggish, unbalanced, fighting him for every degree of bank, every foot of altitude. It didn't matter. He'd been flying Lightning since training, knew the aircraft better than he knew his own car, could feel what it needed before the instruments told him. He brought the nose around, lined up on the second Zero, fired. The Japanese pilot tried to break left, tried to use the Zero's legendary maneuverability to slip the attack. But maneuverability meant nothing when you were already in the gun sight. The 20mm rounds walked up the fuselage like a zipper, punching through aluminum and plexiglass and flesh. The Zero snap-rolled inverted and dove straight down, trailing fire. It hit the jungle canopy and exploded. A brief orange flower blooming in the green. 2 down. The 3rd pilot had seen enough. He broke hard right and ran, pushing his Zero to maximum speed, trying to get separation, trying to get distance between himself and this impossible American who refused to die. Barber let him go. The P-38 was barely holding together as it was, the single remaining engine screaming at maximum power, the airframe vibrating like a tuning fork. Chasing fleeing fighters on one engine was how you ended up in the ocean. He'd made his point. He'd done the impossible. Now he needed to get home. The flight back to base was 60 miles of pure concentration. Every adjustment to the throttle, every slight correction with the rudder, every small change in altitude had to be calculated and deliberate. The P-38 wanted to spiral, wanted to roll, wanted to give up. Barber wouldn't let it. His leg was completely numb from holding the rudder pedal. His shoulder ached from fighting the yoke. Sweat poured down his face despite the freezing air at altitude. But the coastline appeared, then the airfield, then the runway. He brought the Lightning in on final approach, gear down, single engine howling, and greased it onto the tarmac like he'd been flying a perfectly healthy aircraft. The ground crew ran out to meet him. They'd heard the radio calls, knew he was coming in crippled, expected to find a shot-up wreck barely holding together. What they found was a pilot climbing out of his cockpit with a dead engine, 2 confirmed kills, and a story that would spread through every fighter squadron in the Pacific by nightfall. The mechanics gathered around the right nacelle, staring at the damage. The engine had been hit by anti-aircraft fire, shrapnel through the cylinder block, oil lines severed, a complete catastrophic failure. By every measure, it should have forced him to abort. Instead, he'd turned it into an advantage. Word reached higher command within hours. Fighter pilots from other squadrons came by to see the aircraft, to hear the story firsthand, to understand how it had been done. Some of them didn't believe it. A P-38 could fly on one engine, sure, but fight on one engine? Kill 2 Zeros in close combat while half your power plant was dead weight? That was beyond training, beyond skill. That was something else entirely. Barber tried to explain it wasn't magic, wasn't even particularly heroic. The Lightning was designed for this. You just had to trust it. You just had to refuse to quit. But there was more to the story than a single engagement. 3 days earlier, Rex Barber had been part of Operation Vengeance, the mission to intercept and kill Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. 18 P-38’s had flown over 500 miles of open ocean at wave-top height, navigating by dead reckoning, to arrive at a precise point at a precise time to ambush Yamamoto's transport. Barber had been one of the killer flight, one of the pilots tasked with shooting down the bombers carrying Japan's most important military leader. He'd put rounds into one of the bombers, watched it crash into the jungle, helped ensure that Yamamoto would never plan another operation. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The Yamamoto mission had been classified, would remain classified for months, but the impact rippled through the Japanese military immediately. Their best strategic mind was gone. The man who had orchestrated their greatest victories, who understood both Japanese capabilities and American industrial power better than anyone, was dead in the jungle on Bougainville. Morale shattered, strategic planning fractured, and the Americans who had done it couldn't even talk about it. They flew their missions, they fought their battles, they carried the weight of what they'd accomplished in silence. That weight was heavier than any aircraft. Barber understood this. Yamamoto had been a warrior, a professional, someone who'd fought according to the rules of his time and culture. Killing him wasn't personal. It was necessary. It was strategic, but it still meant something. The Japanese pilots he'd shot down over Bougainville had families waiting for them, parents who would receive a telegram or a visit from an officer, mothers who would grieve. War didn't care about that. War kept moving, but the men who fought it carried those deaths with them, stacked them up like cordwood, tried to make sense of the arithmetic that said killing was justified when it served a larger purpose. The P-38 Lightning became Barber's signature. He flew it through the rest of the war, racked up kills, survived engagements that should have killed him. The aircraft saved his life more times than he could count. Single-engine flights became almost routine. Anti-aircraft damage, mechanical failures, fuel system problems, it didn't matter. The Lightning brought him home. Other pilots lost engines and died. Other pilots ditched in the ocean and were never found. Barber kept flying, kept fighting, kept trusting the machine. There was a rhythm to it, a cadence that every combat pilot understood. Take off, climb, form up, fly to the target, engage, survive, return. Repeat, day after day, week after week, month after month. The faces in the ready room changed. New pilots arrived, fresh from training, eager and terrified. Old pilots rotated out, exhausted, hollow-eyed, grateful to be alive. Some didn't rotate out. Some ended up on the missing list, their bunks stripped, their personal effects packed up and shipped home, their names added to the wall of those who wouldn't be coming back. Barber tried not to think about it too much. Thinking was dangerous. Thinking meant remembering the faces of the men who weren't there anymore, the friends who'd bought it over some nameless stretch of ocean or jungle. Thinking meant wondering if today was the day his luck ran out, if this mission was the one where the Lightning couldn't save him, if he'd end up as just another name on a list. So he focused on the mission. He focused on the aircraft. He focused on the next takeoff, the next engagement, the next landing. Everything else was noise. The Zeros kept coming. Different pilots, different tactics, same desperation. By 1943, Japan's best aviators were already gone, killed in the grinding attrition over Guadalcanal and the Coral Sea. The replacements were younger, less trained, more willing to die. They flew with a fatalism that was both terrifying and sad. They'd attack against impossible odds, press attacks that had no chance of success, ram American bombers when they ran out of ammunition. It wasn't courage. It was a different kind of calculus. one where individual survival meant nothing compared to duty and honor. American pilots couldn't understand it. They didn't have to. They just had to shoot them down. The engagement over Bougainville became legend, the story polished with each retelling. Some versions had Barber shooting down 4 Zeros on one engine. Some had him flying for 2 hours with the dead engine. Some had Japanese pilots breaking off in terror, refusing to engage a P-38 that wouldn't die. The truth was impressive enough. 2 confirmed kills, single-engine combat, a successful return to base. But legends needed embellishment, needed to be bigger than life. The men who fought needed heroes, needed proof that skill and determination could overcome impossible odds. Barber became that proof whether he wanted to or not. He didn't feel like a hero. Heroes were the guys who didn't come back, the pilots who pressed attacks knowing they were outgunned and outnumbered, the bomber crews who flew through flak so thick you could walk on it. Heroes were the mechanics who kept the planes flying on spit and determination, the radio operators who stayed at their posts while the ship sank, the medics who ran into fire to pull wounded men to safety. Heroes were everywhere in this war. Barber was just a pilot doing his job, trying to survive, trying to help his squadron mates survive, trying to inch the war one mission closer to finished. The Pacific War was different from Europe. In Europe, you could crash land in occupied territory and maybe evade capture, maybe link up with resistance fighters, maybe make it back to friendly lines. In the Pacific, you went down over water or jungle. Water meant sharks and exposure, and a slow death unless someone picked you up fast. Jungle meant Japanese patrols, disease, starvation, and if you were captured, treatment that made death look merciful. Every mission was all or nothing. You made it back to base or you were gone. The ocean didn't care about your training or your courage or your family waiting at home. The ocean took everyone who touched it the same. Barber understood this calculus intimately. When that engine exploded over Bougainville, when the Zeros moved in for the kill, the ocean was waiting below. Ditching a P-38 was survivable if you did it right. If you hit the water at the correct angle. If you got out before it sank. If your raft deployed. If rescue found you before exposure or sharks did. Too many ifs. Too many variables outside your control. Fighting was simpler. Fighting meant staying in the aircraft, staying in the sky, controlling the engagement. Even on one engine, even against multiple Zeros, fighting gave you agency. Ditching gave you to the ocean. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The P-38 had quirks. Every aircraft did. The cockpit was cramped, the heaters barely worked at altitude, the counter-rotating propellers created unique handling characteristics that could bite inexperienced pilots. But it had range, it had speed, it had firepower concentrated in the nose, all the guns firing through the propeller arc, no convergence issues, no need to calculate where the bullets would meet. Point the nose at the target and pull the trigger. Everything in front of you died. Simple, effective, brutal. That concentrated firepower was what made the single-engine kills possible. With one engine dead, Barber couldn't maneuver like normal. He couldn't sustain a turning fight, couldn't climb aggressively, couldn't energy fight the way P-38 tactics usually demanded, but he could point the nose. And once he pointed the nose, once those guns came to bear, the engagement was over. The Zeros were lightly built, optimized for maneuverability over survivability. A burst of 50 caliber and 20mm fire didn't damage them, it destroyed them. Components failed, structures collapsed, control surfaces separated. The aircraft came apart in the air. Japanese pilots knew this. They'd learned it the hard way over months of combat. The Zero's advantages were speed and turn radius. Get close, get turning, force the Americans into a scissors or a flat spin, where maneuverability mattered more than firepower. But the P-38 pilots had learned too. Boom and zoom, energy fighting, use altitude and speed to dictate the engagement. Dive in, take your shot, climb back out before the Zeros could respond. Never turn with them, never slow down, never give them the fight they wanted. It was methodical, it was calculated, it worked. Barber's single-engine engagement violated all of that. He couldn't boom and zoom with a dead engine. He couldn't energy fight. He couldn't even maintain altitude without a constant struggle, but he could still shoot. And when that first Zero overshot, when it flashed across his gun sight in a moment of fatal overconfidence, instinct and training took over. The manual said you could fight on one engine. The engineer said the aircraft was designed for it. Barber proved they were right. The word spread through the Japanese forces too. Radio intercepts, after-action reports from the pilots who survived, intelligence pieced together from captured documents. The Americans had a pilot who'd killed multiple Zeros while flying a crippled aircraft. The Americans had aircraft that could fight effectively even after catastrophic damage. The Americans kept coming, kept fighting, kept pushing forward no matter the cost. It was a war of attrition, and attrition favored the side with more pilots, more planes, more fuel, more everything. Japan was running out. America was just getting started. By late 1943, the strategic picture was clear to anyone paying attention. Japan had reached its maximum extent, the high watermark of its empire. Every island they held now was under siege. Every supply line was threatened. Every base was a target. The Americans were coming from the east and south, the Australians from the south, the British from the west. There was no good news, no great victory to announce, no turning point that would shift the momentum back. There was only the slow, grinding, inevitable collapse of everything they'd built. The pilots knew it before the politicians did. They saw the quality of their replacements declining, saw the fuel rations getting smaller, saw the maintenance getting shoddier. They flew aircraft that should have been grounded for repairs. They flew missions with partial loads because there wasn't enough fuel for a full tank. They fought Americans who had endless supplies, endless reinforcements, endless everything. And they kept fighting anyway because that's what warriors did. They fought until they couldn't anymore. They fought until they died. Barber respected that. He didn't like it, didn't understand the cultural framework that made it necessary, didn't think dying in a hopeless cause served any useful purpose. But he respected the courage it took to climb into a cockpit knowing you probably weren't coming back, to press an attack knowing it wouldn't change the outcome, to keep fighting when every rational calculation said you'd lost. The men he killed weren't monsters. They were pilots. They were doing their duty the same way he was doing his. The fact that he survived and they didn't was luck, training, and an industrial base that could replace his losses faster than they could replace theirs. The missions continued. Escort duty for bombers hitting Rabaul, sweeps over enemy airfields, ground attack missions against supply dumps and barges. The P-38 did it all. The versatility was both blessing and curse. You were never just a fighter pilot. You were close air support. You were reconnaissance. You were whatever the mission required. Some days you were hunting Zeros at 20,000 feet. Some days you were strafing trucks at treetop level. The aircraft didn't care. It flew the mission. So did the pilot. Ground attack was the most dangerous, flying low and slow over enemy positions, close enough to see the faces of the soldiers shooting at you, close enough to smell the smoke from their rifles. Anti-aircraft fire was everywhere. Every soldier with a rifle was a threat. Every tree line could hide a machine gun. You made your run, dropped your ordnance, or fired your guns and got out as fast as possible. Sometimes you made it, sometimes you didn't. The P-38's twin engines helped. Lose one to ground fire, and you could still fly home. Single-engine fighters didn't have that luxury. They took a hit and they were done. Barber flew those missions too, hated every second of them. The P-38 was built to fight other aircraft, to dominate the sky, not to mud crawl through ground fire hunting for targets that shot back. But the war didn't care what you were built for. The war needed trucks destroyed and bunkers suppressed and supply lines cut. So you flew low, you took your chances, you hoped the armor plate behind your seat was thick enough. Most of the time it was. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The psychological toll accumulated slowly. Every mission added weight. Every loss subtracted something. You couldn't point to when it happened. Couldn't identify the specific moment when you stopped being the eager pilot who'd arrived in theater and became the hollow-eyed veteran who'd seen too much.
It crept up on you. One day you realized you didn't remember the names of half the pilots in your squadron because they rotated through so fast. One day you realized you'd stopped writing letters home because you didn't know what to say anymore. One day you realized the face in the mirror looked 20 years older than it should. Command understood this. They rotated pilots out, sent them stateside for war bond tours or training duty, anything to give them a break from combat.
Some guys welcomed it, some guys resented it. Barber was somewhere in between. Part of him wanted to go home, to sleep in a bed that didn't smell like mildew, to eat food that didn't come from a can, to spend a day where nobody was trying to kill him. Part of him couldn't imagine leaving, couldn't imagine abandoning the squadron, couldn't imagine sitting behind a desk while the war continued without him. The guilt would eat him alive. The war kept moving. Island by island, mile by mile, the Americans pushed forward. Tarawa, Saipan, Guam. The names became a litany of blood and sacrifice. The Marines hit the beaches and died in the surf. The Navy shelled the islands until nothing was left standing. The Air Force bombed anything that moved, and slowly, inexorably, the Japanese were pushed back. Every island taken was another airfield built, another base established, another stepping stone toward Japan itself. Barber flew from those new bases, watched them transform from shell-cratered wasteland to functional military installation in weeks. The Seabees were miracle workers, building runways on coral reefs, erecting towers and hangars and fuel dumps faster than seemed possible. The logistics were staggering. Every bullet, every gallon of fuel, every spare part had to be shipped thousands of miles across hostile ocean. Submarines hunted the supply ships. Aircraft attacked the convoys. Storms scattered the formations. But the supplies kept coming. America's industrial might was fully mobilized now, producing more aircraft, more ships, more ammunition than the rest of the world combined. Japan couldn't match it. They tried. They built aircraft in caves and schoolhouses. They trained pilots with minimal fuel and less time. They threw everything they had into the defense of each island, each atoll, each worthless piece of coral that happened to be one more step toward the home islands. And they lost. They lost at Midway. They lost at Guadalcanal. They lost at the Philippine Sea. They kept losing because the mathematics of attrition were immutable. America lost pilots and built more. Japan lost pilots and couldn't replace them. The quality gap widened. Early in the war, Japanese pilots were among the best in the world, veterans of China with thousands of hours of experience. By 1944, they were sending up teenagers with barely enough training to take off and land. The experienced pilots were dead, the moderately trained pilots were dead, and now the desperate ones were dying too. American pilots like Barber racked up kills not because they were necessarily better warriors, but because they were fighting opponents who'd had a fraction of their training. It wasn't a fair fight. War isn't supposed to be fair. The Kamikaze attack started in late 1944. Japanese pilots deliberately crashing their aircraft into American ships, turning themselves into guided missiles because they lacked the skill to attack conventionally and return home. It was effective in a horrifying way. A pilot who might miss with bombs or torpedoes couldn't miss when he aimed his entire aircraft at a ship. The psychological impact was immense. American sailors watched aircraft dive out of the sky, knowing the pilot intended to die, knowing that shooting him down was the only way to survive. It was a tactic born of desperation, a final throw of the dice when all other options had failed. Barber saw the kamikazes forming up, watched them gather over their bases before heading out on their one-way missions. The fighter escorts tried to stop them. You intercepted them before they reached the fleet, shot them down over water, reduced their numbers before they could do damage. But some always got through. Some always found a target. The ships burned, men died, and the kamikazes kept coming because Japan had more pilots willing to die than they had pilots skilled enough to fight conventionally. It was a kind of mathematical madness. Sacrifice enough pilots, sink enough ships, kill enough Americans, and maybe the United States would decide the cost was too high. Maybe they'd negotiate a peace that left Japan with something rather than the unconditional surrender the Allies demanded. It was a fantasy, a delusion born of cultural factors that American strategists struggled to understand. But the pilots believed it. They climbed into their cockpits, said their goodbyes, and flew off to die because their culture told them it was honorable, because their leaders told them it was necessary, because they had no other choice. Barber couldn't hate them. He pitied them. They were warriors trapped in a war they'd already lost, fighting for a cause that was doomed, dying for leaders who'd send every last one of them to death before admitting defeat. It was a tragedy, a waste of courage and skill and life. But pity didn't stop him from shooting them down. Couldn't stop him. His job was to protect the fleet, to stop the kamikazes, to keep them from reaching the ships. If that meant killing desperate teenagers in obsolete aircraft, then that's what he did. War didn't care about pity. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The P-38 evolved throughout the war. Later models had improved engines, better cockpit heating, dive flaps to prevent compressibility issues at high speed. Each improvement made the aircraft more capable, more survivable, more lethal. But the basic design remained the same. Twin engines, twin booms, tricycle landing gear, concentrated nose armament. It looked like nothing else in the sky. Friend or foe, you knew a P-38 when you saw it. That distinctive silhouette became a symbol, a promise to American forces that air support was available, a threat to Japanese forces that death was on the way. Barber flew the improved models as they became available, appreciated the upgrades, but never forgot that the aircraft that had saved his life over Bougainville was an earlier version. The fundamentals mattered more than the refinements. Know your aircraft, trust your training, refuse to quit. Everything else was details. Good details, useful details, but still details. The core of combat flying hadn't changed since the First World War. Get behind the enemy, shoot him down, don't get shot down yourself. Technology changed the speed and altitude and weapons, but the fundamentals were eternal. Other pilots had their own stories. Other men survived impossible situations, fought against overwhelming odds, made it home when they shouldn't have. The ready rooms were full of those stories, tales swapped over coffee and cigarettes, lessons learned written in blood and passed down to the new guys. Some of it was bravado, the natural exaggeration of men trying to process trauma through humor. Some of it was real, verified by gun camera footage and witness statements and confirmed kills. The line between legend and truth blurred in the retelling. It didn't matter. The point was to learn, to survive, to take the lessons and apply them before you needed them. Barber's story was different only in specifics. Every combat pilot had a moment when everything went wrong, when the mission fell apart, when survival seemed impossible. How you responded to that moment defined you. Some men panicked, made bad decisions, died. Some men froze, let events overwhelm them, died. Some men fought, adapted, survived. Barber had fought. The P-38 had responded. Together they'd done something most people thought was impossible, and then they'd done it again and again, until the war ended and the impossible became just another line in a service record. The atomic bombs fell in August 1945. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, cities vaporized in an instant, hundreds of thousands dead. A demonstration of power so overwhelming that Japan surrendered unconditionally within days. The war was over. No invasion of the home islands, no kamikaze attacks on the landing fleet, no battle for Tokyo, just the sudden, shocking, terrible end that nuclear weapons provide. The debate about whether it was necessary, whether it was moral, whether alternatives existed, that debate would rage for decades. But the pilots who would have flown cover for the invasion, the soldiers who would have hit the beaches, the sailors who would have faced the kamikazes, they knew what the bombs had saved them from. They'd seen what Japan would do to defend its territory. They'd seen the fanaticism, the willingness to die, the absolute refusal to surrender. The invasion would have been a slaughter on both sides. Barber came home in late 1945. The transition was jarring. 1 month you're fighting for your life at 20,000 feet. The next month you're standing in a grocery store staring at shelves full of food, overwhelmed by the normalcy of it all. People who hadn't served didn't understand. They couldn't. They'd read about the war in newspapers, seen it in newsreels, heard radio reports, but they hadn't smelled it, hadn't tasted the fear, hadn't felt what it was like to know that today might be the day you died. The gap between civilian and veteran was a chasm, unbridgeable by words alone. Some veterans talked about it, wrote books, gave speeches, shared their experiences with anyone who would listen. Some veterans never spoke of it at all, locked it away in some dark corner of their mind and refused to let it out. Both approaches had their merits, their costs. Barber was somewhere in the middle. He'd answer questions if asked directly, but he didn't volunteer stories. The war had been necessary, the cause just, the sacrifice meaningful, but it had also been horrible beyond description. A meat grinder that had consumed millions of lives, a testament to humanity's capacity for organized violence. You could be proud of your service and still hate what you'd had to do. Those feelings weren't contradictory. The P-38 was retired from frontline service after the war. Jets were the future, faster and more capable than any propeller-driven aircraft could ever be. The Lightning had done its job, had proven its worth in every theater of the war, but progress demanded replacement. The aircraft that had saved Barber's life, that had carried him through hundreds of combat missions, that had become as familiar to him as his own heartbeat, was declared obsolete and sent to the scrapyard. It hurt more than it should have. The aircraft was a tool, a machine, a collection of aluminum and steel and wiring, but it had been his tool, his machine. They'd survived together. Watching it get scrapped felt like losing a part of himself. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The years passed. The war receded into history, a defining event for a generation, but increasingly distant from the present. New conflicts arose: Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War. Each generation had its own wars to fight, its own veterans to honor, its own stories of sacrifice and courage. The Second World War veterans aged, retired, started to die. The number of men who remembered what it was like to fly a P-38 in combat dwindled every year. Soon, there would be none left. The living memory would be gone, replaced by books and documentaries and artifacts in museums. Barber lived long enough to see the P-38 restored by collectors and aviation enthusiasts, flying again at air shows and exhibitions. He attended some of those shows, stood beside aircraft identical to the one he'd flown, answered questions from people who couldn't imagine what it had been like. They asked about the Yamamoto mission, about the single-engine kills, about what it felt like to fly combat. He answered honestly, but incompletely. Some things couldn't be explained to people who hadn't been there. Some experiences defied translation. You had to live it to understand it. The recognition came late, but it came. Medals, commendations, invitations to speak at military events, and veteran gathering. The younger generation wanted to honor the older, wanted to express gratitude for what had been sacrificed, wanted to ensure the stories weren't forgotten. Barber accepted graciously, but without much enthusiasm. He hadn't fought for recognition. He'd fought because his country was at war, and he was a pilot. And that's what pilots did. The medals didn't change what had happened. They didn't bring back the men who died. They didn't erase the memories that still woke him up at night decades after the war ended. But they mattered to other people. They mattered to the families of the men who'd served alongside him, the children who wanted to know their fathers had been part of something important. They mattered to a nation that needed heroes, needed to believe that courage and skill and determination could overcome any obstacle. So he accepted the medals, gave the speeches, told the stories. If it helped people understand, if it honored the memory of the men who hadn't come home, then it was worth doing. The single-engine engagement over Bougainville remained the defining moment of his war, not the Yamamoto mission, despite its strategic importance, not the dozens of other kills he'd racked up over years of combat. That one fight, when the engine exploded and the Zeros moved in and everything seemed lost, that was the moment that defined him. It was the moment when training and instinct and the P-38’s engineering all came together perfectly. It was the moment when he proved to himself that he could handle anything the war threw at him. It was the moment when he stopped being afraid of dying and started focusing on fighting. That mindset had carried him through the rest of the war. Fear was useful. Fear kept you alert, kept you cautious, kept you alive. But paralytic fear, the kind that made you hesitate or freeze or run, that would get you killed faster than any Zero. Once he'd fought and won on one engine, once he'd proven he could survive the impossible, the fear lost its power over him. He was still scared. Every combat pilot was scared, but the fear didn't control him anymore. He controlled it, channeled it, used it to sharpen his reactions and heighten his awareness. The Zeros were still dangerous. The war was still deadly, but he was more dangerous than either. That confidence made him a better pilot, a better leader, a better teacher when they started assigning him to train new pilots. He could pass on the technical skills easily enough, how to dogfight, how to navigate, how to handle the P-38’s quirks. But the mental aspects, the psychological resilience required to keep climbing into a cockpit, knowing that today might be your last, that was harder to teach. Some men had it naturally. Some men developed it through experience. Some men never got it and washed out or died. You couldn't predict who would succeed and who would fail. You could only give them the tools and hope they used them when the time came. The new pilots asked about the single-engine fight. They always did. Barber told them the truth. The P-38 could do it. The manual said so. The engineers had designed it specifically for that capability. But you had to trust the aircraft, had to be willing to fight when every instinct said to run. The Zeros had made a mistake. They'd gotten overconfident, assumed the smoking engine meant an easy kill. That assumption had killed them. Never assume anything in combat. Never underestimate your opponent. Never let confidence become arrogance. The moment you think you're safe is the moment you die. Some of them listened. Some of them thought they knew better. Some of them died in training accidents before they ever saw combat. The ones who made it to the combat zones faced a different war than Barber had fought. The Pacific in 1945 was not the Pacific in 1943. Japanese resistance was fiercer, more desperate, more willing to sacrifice everything for minimal gains. The kamikazes were everywhere. The flak was heavier. The missions were longer and more dangerous. But the fundamentals hadn't changed. Shoot first, shoot straight, go home. Everything else was commentary. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. Barber's final thoughts on the war were complicated. Pride in what had been accomplished, horror at what it had cost, relief that it was over, sadness for the men who hadn't made it home. The Japanese pilots he'd killed haunted him sometimes. Not guilt, exactly. He'd done what was necessary, what was right given the circumstances. But awareness. They'd been men like him, pilots like him, warriors doing their duty. Different uniforms, different flags, different causes, but fundamentally the same. Young men sent to war by old men, asked to kill and die for abstract concepts like honor and nation and empire. Some of them had been skilled, some had been brave, all of them had been human. Their deaths diminished the world just as every death did. But the alternative had been worse. Japan's empire had been built on atrocity, on the systematic brutalization of entire populations. The things they'd done in China, in Korea, in the Philippines, those weren't aberrations, they were policy. Stopping that, ending that, that was worth fighting for. The men he'd killed might have been honorable warriors in the sky, but they were fighting for a cause that was fundamentally evil. The moral calculus wasn't simple, but it was clear enough. Stopping a greater evil sometimes required becoming a lesser one. Killing to prevent killing. Destroying to prevent destruction. War's oldest paradox. He'd lived with that paradox for 60 years after the war ended. It never got easier. It never made perfect sense. But it was the truth as he understood it. The men who'd fought World War II had saved the world from fascism. They'd sacrificed their youth, their innocence, often their lives, to stop something that would have plunged humanity into a new dark age. That was worth celebrating, worth honoring, worth remembering. But it had also been hell. Unimaginable, soul-destroying hell. Both things were true simultaneously. You couldn't understand the war without accepting both truths. The P-38 Lightning that had saved his life over Bougainville was long gone, melted down for scrap metal, recycled into car parts or refrigerators or new aircraft. But its descendants remained. Not direct descendants. The Lightning had no modern successor, but the principle it represented. American engineering, American industrial might, American determination to build whatever was needed to win. That principle had won World War II. It had won the Cold War. It remained the foundation of American military power. The aircraft changed, the technology evolved, but the core stayed the same. Build it better, build it tougher, build it in quantities that overwhelm the enemy. Quantity has a quality all its own, Stalin had said. He was right. Barber died in 2001, 56 years after the war ended. He'd lived a full life, raised a family, built a career, contributed to his community. The war had been a chapter, an important chapter, but still just a chapter. He'd refused to let it define him, refused to be just the guy who shot down Zeros on one engine. But it was the first thing mentioned in his obituary. That fight over Bougainville, that impossible victory, that moment when everything went wrong and he made it right through skill and determination and trust in his aircraft. That was what people remembered. That was what would last long after his death. The story of the pilot who refused to quit, the aircraft that wouldn't die, and the enemy who learned too late that Americans didn't play by the rules they expected. The lesson was simple. Never underestimate your opponent. Never assume the fight is over until it's over. Never confuse damage with defeat. The P-38 had looked finished, smoking engine trailing behind it, struggling to stay airborne. It wasn't. The pilot looked beaten, outnumbered 3-1, unable to maneuver. He wasn't. The Japanese pilots had made a fatal error. They'd assumed the external appearance reflected the internal reality. They'd assumed that looking defeated meant being defeated. They'd assumed wrong, and that assumption had killed them. War is full of such moments. Battles that seemed lost until someone refused to accept defeat. Campaigns that seemed impossible until someone found a way. Wars that seemed endless until someone broke the enemy's will. The Pacific War had been that kind of struggle. Island by island, mile by mile, death by death, the Americans had pushed forward. They'd lost battles, lost ships, lost thousands of men. But they'd never lost a war because they'd never stopped fighting. The industrial base kept producing, the training camps kept graduating new pilots, the shipyards kept launching new vessels. Japan couldn't match it. No nation on Earth could match it. American power, once fully mobilized, was unstoppable. Barber had been one small part of that machine. One pilot among thousands. One P-38 among tens of thousands of aircraft. One mission among millions. But his moment over Bougainville, that one fight, captured something essential about the American way of war. Pragmatic, adaptable, relentless. The engine was dead. So what? Fight on the remaining engine. The odds were against you. So what? Make your own odds. The enemy expects you to run. So don't run. Fight. Win. Survive. Go home. That ethos had carried America through World War II, through Korea, through Vietnam, through every conflict since. The specifics changed, the technology evolved, the enemies varied, but the core principle remained. Americans don't quit. They adapt. They innovate. They overcome. Not because they're inherently superior warriors, but because they're trained to think independently, to solve problems creatively, to trust their equipment and their training and themselves. That combination, when properly developed and supported, made them formidable opponents. The Japanese pilots over Bougainville had learned that lesson the hard way. So had the Germans in Europe. So had every enemy who'd faced American forces and assumed that material superiority was the only factor that mattered. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The P-38's legacy extended beyond its combat record. It proved that unconventional designs could work, that twin-engine fighters were viable, that concentrated armament was superior to wing-mounted guns. It influenced post-war aircraft design, contributed to lessons learned, helped shape the jets that would replace it. The engineering principles that let it fly on one engine, that made it stable and controllable even when half its power was gone, those principles informed future designs. Nothing was wasted. Every success, every failure, every mission flown added to the collective knowledge base that made the next generation of aircraft better. Barber understood that connection. The P-38 he'd flown wasn't the final word in fighter design. It was one step in an ongoing evolution. The jets that replaced it were faster, more powerful, more capable. But they'd built on the Lightning's foundation, learned from its strengths and weaknesses, incorporated its successes into their own design philosophy. That was progress. That was how technology advanced. Each generation standing on the shoulders of the previous one, reaching higher, going faster, becoming more effective. The P-38's retirement wasn't a failure, it was graduation. The aircraft had done its job so well, it had made itself obsolete. The men who'd flown it felt differently. For them, it wasn't just a stepping stone. It was the aircraft that had kept them alive, that had brought them home when they should have died, that had responded to their inputs and fought alongside them and become an extension of their will. You didn't develop that kind of relationship with a machine and then discard it casually. The rational part of their brain understood that progress required replacement. The emotional part grieved anyway. The P-38 had earned loyalty, had earned respect, had earned a place in their hearts that no jet would ever quite fill. New generations of pilots came up in different aircraft. F-86 Sabres over Korea, F-4 Phantoms over Vietnam, F-15 Eagles in the modern era. Each had its own characteristics, its own strengths, its own devoted pilots who swore their aircraft was the best ever built. Maybe they were right. Technology advanced, performance improved. But the bond between pilot and aircraft, that never changed. The machine that saved your life, that responded to your touch, that fought alongside you, that became your partner in the most dangerous work imaginable. That bond transcended specifications and performance metrics. It was personal, it was primal, it was eternal. Barber's story, that fight over Bougainville, became a touchstone for pilots who came after. Proof that the impossible was achievable. Proof that training and determination could overcome any obstacle. Proof that the aircraft would do what you asked if you trusted it and flew it right. Instructors used it as a teaching example. Here's what proper procedure looks like. Here's what happens when you don't panic. Here's what you can accomplish when you refuse to give up. The details varied depending on the aircraft and the situation, but the core lesson remained constant. The fight isn't over until you decide it's over. Keep fighting. Keep flying. Keep trusting the machine and yourself. Everything else is detailed. The Zeros never expected it. That was their fatal error. They saw the smoke, saw the dead engine, made assumptions based on their own doctrine and training. Japanese pilots were taught to withdraw when damaged, to preserve the aircraft and the pilot for future missions. It made sense given their limited industrial capacity and training pipeline. Every aircraft lost was hard to replace. Every pilot killed was irreplaceable. So when they saw a damaged American fighter, they assumed the pilot would run, would try to escape, would prioritize survival over combat. That's what they would have done. That's what their training demanded. Barber didn't run. The P-38 doctrine was different. American training was different. You had a mission. Complete the mission or die trying. If your aircraft could still fly, it could still fight. If you could still shoot, you were still in the battle. Retreat was an option, but it was the last option, used only when continuing the fight served no purpose. A damaged aircraft with guns that still worked and a pilot who could still fly wasn't finished. It was wounded, and wounded animals were the most dangerous of all. The first Zero that overshot learned that lesson in the fraction of a second before he died. Too close, too fast, too confident. The P-38's guns tracked onto target automatically. The convergence issue that plagued wing-mounted guns completely absent. Point the nose, pull the trigger, watch the enemy disintegrate. The mechanical simplicity of it was beautiful. No calculation, no compensation, no guesswork, just pure cause and effect. You pointed correctly, you hit. You hit, they died. The second Zero had a moment longer to process what was happening, but not long enough to matter. By the time his brain registered that the crippled American was shooting instead of running, the rounds were already in the air, already hitting, already killing. The third pilot broke off. Survival instinct overrode training, overrode duty, overrode everything. He'd watched 2 aircraft get destroyed in seconds by a target that should have been helpless. His brain couldn't process it, couldn't reconcile what he'd seen with what he'd been taught, so he ran. He'd probably been disciplined when he got back to base, probably been questioned about why he'd abandoned the engagement. What could he say? The American refused to die? The damaged aircraft fought back? His wingmen had been killed while attacking a crippled opponent? None of those answers would satisfy his commanders. None of them would make sense to people who hadn't seen it happen. But he'd survived, and somewhere in his mind, he carried the knowledge that American pilots didn't follow the rules, didn't accept defeat, didn't quit when they were supposed to. That knowledge would make him more cautious, more hesitant, less effective in future engagements. Fear was a weapon, too. Barber had just deployed it perfectly. The Pacific War ended 14 months after that fight. 14 months of island hopping, carrier battles, kamikaze attacks, and incremental advances toward Japan. Barber flew through all of it, racked up more kills, survived more close calls, watched more friends die. The single-engine engagement remained unique, a moment frozen in time, the peak of his combat experience. Nothing else quite matched it for pure improbability. Other fights were more tactically important. Some involved higher stakes, some were more difficult, but none captured the essence of what it meant to be a fighter pilot in World War II, quite like that moment when the engine exploded and he chose to fight anyway. That choice echoed through the decades. Veterans told the story to their children, their grandchildren. Aviation historians wrote about it, analyzed it, used it in studies of aerial combat tactics. The P-38 enthusiast community kept it alive, made sure everyone who cared about the Lightning knew about the pilot who'd proven what the aircraft could do when pushed to its limits. And slowly, gradually, inevitably, the story became legend. The details were embellished, the odds exaggerated, the enemy numbers inflated. That's what happens to all great stories. The truth gets worn smooth by retelling until only the essential core remains. But the core was enough. A pilot faced impossible odds and won. An aircraft performed beyond what should have been possible. The enemy learned too late that Americans don't surrender just because the situation looks hopeless. That core truth, that essential message, that was worth preserving, worth retelling, worth remembering for as long as people flew aircraft and fought wars, and needed examples of what courage and skill and determination could accomplish. Rex Barber, sitting in his living room 6 decades after the war, understood this better than most. The facts of what happened over Bougainville were simple. One engine quit. He fought on the other. He killed 2 Zeros and scared off a 3rd. He flew home. End of story. But the meaning of what happened, the symbolic weight it carried, the inspiration it provided to generations of pilots who came after, that was profound. That was worth the embellishment, worth the legend, worth the continued retelling. Because the message wasn't really about him. It wasn't about the P-38. It was about refusing to accept defeat, about finding a way when no way seemed to exist, about trusting yourself and your training and your equipment even when everything seemed impossible. That message transcended aviation. It applied to life, to challenges of every kind, to situations where giving up seemed like the only rational choice. Don't give up. Keep fighting. Find a way. The engine might be smoking, the odds might be against you, the enemy might be closing in, but you're not dead yet, and until you're dead, you can still win. That was the lesson of Bougainville. That was what the story meant. That was why it mattered. The P-38 Lightning with 1 engine dead and a pilot who refused to quit. The Zeros that made the fatal mistake of underestimating American resolve. The engagement that should have ended in disaster, but ended in victory. That story, in all its variations and retellings, was why we remember. Not for the specific details of that one fight on that one day in 1943, but for what it represented, the American spirit, tested in the crucible of war and emerging victorious. Not through superior numbers or better equipment, though both helped, but through sheer determination, refusal to accept defeat, and the courage to keep fighting when every rational instinct screamed to run. That was the legacy Rex Barber left behind. Not medals or kill counts or tactical innovations, but proof that the impossible was achievable if you had the skill, the courage, and the stubbornness to see it through. Proof that the machine would do what you asked if you trusted it. Proof that Americans, when pushed to the limit and beyond, would find a way to win. That legacy, hammered out in the sky over Bougainville on a day when everything went wrong and one pilot made it right, that legacy endures. As long as there are pilots, as long as there are wars, as long as there are people who need inspiration to face impossible odds, the story of the P-38 that flew on 1 engine and killed 5 Zeros will be told. The numbers will vary, the details will shift, but the core truth will remain. Never quit. Never surrender. Never accept that you're beaten until you actually are. And sometimes, if you're skilled enough, and determined enough, and lucky enough, you'll prove that even when the engine explodes and the enemy closes in, the fight isn't over. It's just getting started.